Downton Abbey, and we've had the Wild West, and now we have Peter. And I just want to say, I mean, Peter has been a key part of BELMAS for a long time, as Honorary Vice President as well. And as reader and professor in Birmingham University, has worked really very powerfully with a number of colleagues, including Helen and others. And this interrelationship is, I think, an important thing to bear in mind as we look at the history that we're considering today. There's just one particular connection which Peter made for me way back. 1993, published Greenfield on education administration. And Tom Greenfield was, I think, for me, one of the key writers who made sense as a practitioner at the time, overburdened with the Taylorist approaches and the kind of mechanical view of the way things should work. And Peter and Tom produced a book called Education Administration Towards a Humane Science. And in the frontispiece, and I'm just going to substitute Peter's name in the quotation at the beginning, he quotes Hamlet and says, I think this applies to Peter. What a piece of work is Peter. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, a paragon of animals. I present Peter Ribbins.
Well, good morning, colleagues. I think I really have a thoroughly thankless task trying to follow Helen and Ron, so I hope you're going to be gentle with me. I can claim to have been a member almost as long as Ron, and so I do feel very honoured to be asked to take part in the celebrations of its 40th year. Given just 25 minutes to speak, I'll cheat a bit with a short talk and a long paper. And so the details of my talk, if you want to follow them up afterwards, are in the paper, which I hope to distribute then. What my lecture will be about, drawing on ongoing work with Brian Sherritt, and I should say that I've been very lucky with the people I've been able to work with over the years. It focuses on the 8 permanent secretaries who've been at the Department for Education from 1976 to 2011. And its immediate context is the hard times which I think the civil service currently faces. Introducing a major reform plan, which was produced earlier this year, Francis Lord, he's the Cabinet Office Minister with responsibility, claims, and I quote, that ministers from this government and previous ones have too often found decisions they have made do not get implemented. There are cases where permanent secretaries have blocked agreed government policy from going ahead or advised other officials not to implement ministerial decisions. This is unacceptable, he says. He goes on to argue that what is needed is a smaller, pacier, flatter, more digital service, more accountable for effective implementation, more capable with better management information, more unified, consistent, and corporate, or in short, more like a business, and certainly a good deal less bureaucratic. Last week, the DFE produced its own plan. It found that the biggest change that was required was, and I quote, adjusting the culture and the way people behave. I'm glad about the reference to people. They're so often forgotten in our studies, I'm afraid. To focus, I'm not so sure about the second bit, ruthlessly on ministerial priorities, that all whilst driving up effectiveness and reducing staffing by a quarter in the next 3 years. Quite ambitious, you might think. In what follows, I will consider the implications of the Civil Service Reform Plan. It's going to affect us all, for permanent secretaries and their role in policy, and conclude with some tentative suggestions for future research. The plan stresses, and again I quote, that if much policy advice is excellent, debatable, the quality of policy making is often inconsistent, drawing on too narrow a range of views and evidence, and too often giving insufficient attention to implementation. Tackling this, it argues, means that permanent secretaries must, and I quote, be accountable for the quality of the policy advice in their departments and prepared to challenge policies that do not have a sound basis in evidence and practice. It goes on to argue that departments in the future will still be headed by a Secretary of State and a permanent secretary who reports to him or her. And it argues that this dual leadership requires clarity over responsibility and reporting lines. Sadly, very little light is thrown on what such clarity might actually look like, or even how it might be considered in the future. But the plan does go on to argue that allowing secretaries of state to have greater influence over the appointment and presumably tenure, although it doesn't say this, of the permanent secretary increases the chance of this relationship working successfully. All I can say is it really seems to me that this is open to question and certainly hard to square with their obligation both to challenge policies when necessary and to develop policy in line with ministerial wishes. That's really asking to square the circle, isn't it? The plan also claims, and I quote, for too long operational management and delivery has been undervalued compared with policy development. In future, the leadership of the civil service will need to have greater operational experience and ability. And for me, this seems to mean 6 main things. First of all, breaking down the barrier between the private sector and the civil service. Secondly, recruiting from a much wider range of backgrounds than has tended to be the norm in the past. Thirdly, appointing to senior levels more of those who have led public and private sector bodies. Fourthly, requiring candidates for senior posts in delivery departments to have had at least 2 years in commercial or operational roles. Fifthly, moving to a more equal balance between those with a career in operational management and those in policy advice. And finally, questioning whether permanent secretaries really must in the future, as they've tended to be in the past, be generalists. So those are the 6 things that I would draw from what the plan is recommending. For me, a key question in all this is, what do we actually know of permanent secretaries and their role in policy making? Talking to one recently, David Normington, he said to me that unlike politicians, we rarely write autobiographies. And that's true. There are very, very few biographies or autobiographies of permanent secretaries. Now, whilst permanent secretaries are widely seen to be influential, they have actually been the subject of scant individual or longitudinal research. I find that quite astonishing. With the reforms in mind, I will try and say something, and these are the permanent secretaries in order from the earliest first onwards. I will try and say something about James Hamilton, David Hancock, John Keynes, Geoffrey Holland, Tim Lancaster, Michael Bigshard, David Normington, and David Bell, who retired at the end of last year, in terms of their background, career, and their relationships with ministers. You notice all were men. There's never been a woman who's held that role at the DFE. Only one, that was Bigshard, claims to have a working class background. As he said to us, my father was a docker. Only Hamilton read for a degree which is not broadly in the humanities, and that was engineering. On education and career history, it's possible, it seems to me, to distinguish two groups. 5, Hancock, Keynes, Holland, Lancaster, and Normington, took what might be called the classical route of public school and Oxbridge, and then almost immediate entry into the civil service, although actually 2 of them did do national service and claimed that that was a very important experience for them. The other 3, Hamilton, Bishard, and Bell, all attended state schools and red brick universities, and curiously, all 3 also had major careers prior to entering the administrative civil service. Only Normington actually had spent a long prior career at the DFE, and only Bell could claim to be an educationist, a distinguished educationist. None had worked in the private sector, but Bell and Bishard had both led major public sector bodies. The 8 of them averaged 4.5 years in posts, whereas the 16 ministers with whom they worked averaged only 2.2 years. In 10 years at the Home Office and then the DFE, or actually the other way around, Normington served 9 ministers. So in just less than 10 years, 9 ministers. This has surely got to be dysfunctional. But when I asked him about it, he rather wryly said, "That's what you're trained to cope with," and why you have a permanent civil service to support ministers. He, Hamilton, Bell, and Keynes all served 4 ministers at the DFE. And it seems to me that if it takes time to build up a productive working relationship, this was in very short supply during these years, because in all there were what you might call 23 partnerships between permanent secretaries and secretaries of state over this period, and they averaged 1.6 years, with 8 being less than a year. Before turning to the relationship between these dual leaders, I will consider whether permanent secretaries overvalue policy and undervalue organizational and operational management. As it happens, all but Lancaster explicitly denied doing this. As Bell put it, I probably gave more of my time and attention to my chief executive accounting officer role than some of my predecessors. Normington, citing his earlier careers, felt, "I brought into a senior policy roles a strong sense of operational management." Like Bell and Bishard, he stressed that he and the DFE took implementation and management very seriously, but hinted that this may have been less true of some of his predecessors. But this was actually denied explicitly by most of his predecessors. Hamilton, for example, claimed to take a managerial orientation, and Keynes told us about taking a course at the Manchester Business School in management and having a qualification in management, and so may, and I quote, "have pursued management with more zeal and vigor than some others." On policy, Hamilton and Keynes, Brian and I wrote a paper on that, claimed to hold traditional civil service values in which, having advised, they sought faithfully to implement the wishes of the Secretary of State. But if both were seen as effective managers by ministers, and they both were, only Keynes seemed to have been a true believer, whereas Hamilton was at best agnostic. To enable critical examination of the notion of civil service impartiality in supporting policy through successive, often incompatible political administrations, Brian and I have proposed a framework in a number of related parts. The first part in 2 related parts. The first turns on the notion of centrism and is set out in our paper in the email 40th celebratory edition, so I won't say any more about that. I will focus on the second part. From our field data, we identified a continuum of activity of 5 main types, varying according to how far a permanent secretary plays an active or a passive part as a maker, resistor, shaper, sharer, or taker in the policy role. A permanent secretary is a maker where the policy is his or her idea, usually progressed with the agreement of the Secretary of State. An example of this is the lead that Bichard took in setting up the Learning and Skills Council. Having put the idea to David Blunkett, he stressed that, given the way David and I work, we began to share concerns about existing arrangements. We talked, and gradually ideas developed. It is true, I said to him, I think we should bite this bullet. Blunkett, for his part, acknowledged the part that Bichard had played, and he said, we set up the LSE when nobody else thought we could. Conversely, the initiatives which Hamilton, a convinced centralist, took seemed to me to be a paradigm case of an official taking a policy lead. He wanted, and I quote, a deep revision of the 1944 Act, and in doing so, in his time, and he was the longest serving of all the ones we looked at, he set a powerful trajectory which dominated policy for the remainder of the century, leading in less than a decade, for example, to the setting up of a national school curriculum. He succeeded in doing this despite the fact that of the 2 prime ministers and 4 secretaries of state he served during his 7 years, only one, Jim Callaghan, actually seemed to have shared his ambition. In doing so, Hamilton admitted, and these are his words, to engaging in what he called covert policy making and later undercover work, which he knew did not accord with the wishes of his ministers, Mully, Williams, Carlisle, and Joseph. And you can hardly get much more different 4 than that 4. As a resistor, the activities of a permanent secretary fits uneasily with the Civil Service Code of Practice, but much depends on the reason for resisting and the nature of expression. The Code's values of integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality mean civil servants should act solely according to the merits of a case, and in doing so serve the government, whatever its political persuasion, to the best of their abilities. They must not act in any way controlled by party political considerations or allow personal political views to determine the advice they give or the actions they take. Hamilton on education vouchers offers arguably the best example of resistance. This was a policy that he knew Keith Joseph dearly wanted, but this case demonstrates the problem of determining the legitimacy of opposition. For Hamilton, the issue was, and I quote, not so much on political grounds and more about practicability and the dangers of exacerbating the gap between the haves and have-nots. The second seems to me actually to be more political than pragmatic. In resisting, Hamilton didn't do it directly. What he did was to rely on Walter Ulrich, a deputy secretary, who he claimed was, quote, doing what a good civil servant should. He did not oppose vouchers, but pointed out the great difficulties over and over again. This view was disputed by ministers, Bob Dunn and Kenneth Baker, and by political advisors, Stuart Sexton and Oliver Letwin. For Sexton, Ulrich blocked the policy because, and I quote, he was a Labour supporter, and unlike the theoretical civil servant who is apolitical and impartial, he had his own agenda and pursued it. Hamilton's take was such situations can lead to dispute in which the minister, quote, feels his wishes are being frustrated and the civil servant feels it is duty to point out the difficulties. After months of debate, according to Sexton, Keith Joseph finally gave up. That's a quote. Or as Hamilton put it, Keith withdrew with good grace. A permanent secretary can be a shaper in reacting to policy advice, ideas that come from a Secretary of State or elsewhere, usually as a policy technician, using her or his experience, ability, and skills to develop and manage policy processes. He or she will critically be highly practiced in the dark arts of government and will have honed a capacity to anticipate the likely course of public policies. Once a minister has articulated a policy goal, it is for the official to produce a range of policy options. As such, permanent secretaries shape policy insofar as they are persuasive in advising a Secretary of State as to which option would result in the most positive outcome, having regard to political acceptability and operational practicability. An example again would be Hancock and his relationship with Baker in enabling the 1988 Act. As he recalls it, that's as Hancock recalls it, the Conservatives were elected when the Conservatives were elected in 1987, quote, "We had to draft the bill and it was extremely hard work. Baker was very good about going through the detail." That's not the impression you get from reading Margaret Thatcher or Lawson. Going through the detail. "We used to go through the draft line by line at endless meetings." Baker, for his part, recalled that he and Hancock worked very closely together. "I must have seen him once, twice, or even 3 times a day. David had a big role in bringing the department to back it. He was very committed to the great changes we were bringing in. He wasn't just appeasing me, we soldiered on together." A permanent secretary is a sharer when working closely with a Secretary of State on the formation of a policy, typically in close collaboration. As Bichard put it, you don't often have the kind of rapport that I happen to have with David Blunkett. This is partly personal chemistry, it's partly backgrounds. It's a joy when you get that kind of relationship between a politician and official. For Blunkett, their relationship was one of mutual respect. It was robust. He was good at his job. We complemented each other well and had a common purpose. Because we had mutual respect, we could hear each other even when we didn't agree. He could tell me, "I think you're going a bit far here." And I could say to him, "Michael, this person is not really delivering." Instead of going into defense mode, he would say to me, "Let's have a proper look at this." This made it possible for them to work through many difficult issues whilst at the same time delivering the literacy and numeracy program and revamping the whole of teacher training as they saw it. Blunkett saw Bichard as an outstanding manager with the understanding that you cannot manage if you don't understand and appreciate the impact of policy. Finally, as a taker of policy, a permanent secretary assumes the traditional Whitehall role of offering dispassionate advice and then implementing the will of the minister. Barberis delightfully describes this as the bureaucratic equivalent of the shopkeeper's lament that the customer is always right. However, taking does not necessarily entail impotence or imply disapproval. Just as policy shaping can be seen as pragmatically implementing political will through policy outcomes, so policy taking usually allows a degree of freedom for the official on the options that might be adopted in arriving at a desired outcome. Hancock's time account of his secondment to the European Union offers an interesting example. "I was there for 6 months before the UK joined and a year afterwards. It was very exciting and hard work because nobody in Whitehall had a clue how the community worked. I spent my whole life writing letters saying, no, it's not like that, you can't do that, you have to do it this way. I tried to teach them to make the community work in their interests. It was uphill work." And so on. Reflecting on our model, we asked most of the permanent secretaries to reflect on this 5-part model. Bell said, "I don't know if the political context had changed in terms of ministerial assertiveness, but it's very hard to see where people have actively resisted. I was always clear that once you knew what the political will was, your job was to try and make it happen. This did not mean exactly as first articulated. Perhaps it was not sufficiently well thought through, or there were practical difficulties. Nevertheless, it seems to me that in the current context, you have to be a taker of policy. He concludes that during his time, whilst ministers were prepared to work with senior civil servants, what they wanted was for the service not to be, and I quote, sitting around crafting beautiful policy, but to focus far more than in the past on the implementation of such policy. We heard similarly from Beechard and Normington, but also from our earlier officials, notably Keynes and Hancock. So where to next? A key uncertainty in the plan lies in the idea of dual-track leadership. In our research, we found both positive, Hancock and Baker, Beechard and Blunkett, Normington and Clark, and negative, Pyle and Thatcher. Thatcher tried to get rid of Pyle. Hamilton and Mulley, Holland and Patton. There's rumour that Holland and Patton at the end stopped talking to each other, although they both subsequently denied that's true. So there were positive and negative relationships. What this suggests to me is an urgent need for much more research. Sadly, our study of successive permanent secretaries in a single department, as far as we know, is unique. There's surely a compelling case for similar research in other ministerial Whitehall ministries. And for this, we would propose a three-level approach. And I am nearly finishing, David. Level one would seek portraits of individuals as they view across a range of issues reported in some depth. Fenwick English, the American scholar, defines portraits as fairly detailed verbal renderings that are not full-blown biographies. Where you have several people holding the same role and they're studied together, this can enable a kind of group biography that English calls a prosopography. If our study of permanent secretaries had been restricted just to them, it would have been a level one project. However, setting what they told us against interviews that we did with a series of significant others in Westminster and Whitehall made it a second level study. You could set them against each other to some extent. Exploring what permanent secretaries say in terms of what they then do would be a third level study. For this, the research must observe them acting out their role in relevant situations, discuss with them what they were doing, set this against the views of significant others, and in producing a final account, compare and contrast all the available evidence. It'd be nice to have some evidence of that kind. Like Rhodes, we would call for more ethnographically orientated inquiry of this kind. Illustrating its potentials, he reports on a fairly small-scale study of 3 middle-ranking service ministries. Groundbreaking as that study was, it is very modest in scope, but its merits make me regret the lack of a single in-depth published ethnography of any Whitehall department. But, having said that, I know how very hard it would be to secure access, maintain ownership, and negotiate reporting. And finally, for Peter Hennessy, in improving Whitehall, and I quote, the most important ingredient for change is people, back to people. Whatever the merits of the reform plan, I doubt if it gives enough consideration to people. But if its flaws flow from this limitation, they may also reflect inadequacies in its research base. As a former permanent secretary and head of the civil service, a very distinguished one, Sir Richard Wilson so aptly put it, if you want to reform a great institution, you must understand it and its people. If you want to understand it, you need to understand its past. So let's have more of that. Thank you.